Hi, I'm Ralph Thorn, and ordinarily people associate me with knife throwing or describe me as a knife thrower, but that's only part of what we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to show you a much more inclusive use of throwing for self-defense that goes beyond what people think of as knife throwing. Our school is one of the main pioneers of the modern no-spin style of weapons throwing that has exploded in popularity over the last few years. About a decade and a half ago, the no-spin movement appeared in public simultaneously in 3 different parts of the world: Russia, Japan, and North America. The American style, which was started by me, was best at hand-to-hand combat range, very mobile and versatile in terms of attack angles, and the best at the use of big knives, even swords. The other styles were more oriented towards small weapons and long-range throwing. These 3 streams originally developed independently of one another, but these streams ran together and formed a kind of river when the next generation of throwers that came along after us took things from all the styles of no-spin and put them together. That's really what the modern no-spin approach is today, a hybrid of my knife throwing style with shuriken and Russian techniques for extreme long-range throwing. The no-spin style is the martial arts style of weapon throwing. Obviously, if a pointed weapon flies straight like an arrow instead of tumbling end over end in the air, it has a much better chance to stick a moving target or a target at a random range, so this is really the only useful self-defense throw. Just as important is the fact that the no-spin takes much of the difficulty out of throwing. There are people who want you to think that knife throwing is hard because they want you to know how talented they must be, but it really isn't hard at all. You don't have to be an athlete or to practice several hours a day to throw weapons in this style. And in contemporary weapons throwing, we don't try to force a square peg into a round hole. Everyone is different, and we take age, body type, and natural ability into consideration. There's something for everyone. It's a very varied activity, and really it's a great deal of fun. Of course, given the world we live in, weapons throwing has a serious side as well. I think movies have had a negative effect on serious weapons throwing because nobody uses knife throwing more or understands it less than the movie industry, so there are a lot of false impressions out there. There are still some more reality-based martial artists who consider weapons throwing to be a Hollywood fantasy, but the fact is that throwing weapons have been used effectively for all of human history, both in wars and hunting. For example, slings, battle axes, beginning with spears, and before that, rocks. Obviously, even a game like dodgeball couldn't exist if it were not possible to throw something effectively enough to hit someone with it, even if they were trying to prevent you from hitting them. In a nutshell, it might make sense to deny the practicality of a spinning weapon, but the no-spin style is so powerful and versatile that it puts the myth that weapons throwing is useless to bed. Anyone who still doesn't believe that weapons throwing or knife throwing is a viable means of self-defense hasn't been keeping up. So the no-spin had pretty much conquered knife throwing, but the problem is I was never satisfied with any of the existing methods for throwing smaller or improvised weapons at actual combat range, including my own methods. All the existing methods just worked okay. None of them worked great. I was getting requests from serious martial artists to teach them a method for throwing the weapons they actually already carried, such as lock blade pocket knives. Also, the style of self-defense that we were teaching, oriented more towards power throwing, works for martial artists, but is a little beyond the physical capabilities of some of those who might need weapons throwing most. So after some study and experimentation, I came up with a system that would enable throwers to use smaller, more improvised weapons effectively. I developed these new methods because all the existing methods were either too weak, too slow on the release, not accurate enough, or not versatile enough. They all did something well, but none of them did everything well. So after a lifetime spent practicing weapons throwing and a couple of decades spent studying it, talking to others about it, and teaching it directly in seminars all across the country, I at last feel comfortable in saying we have reached the final stage of the no-spin movement. Theory and practice have come together in an approach that is both more streamlined compared to the old ways, but at the same time much broader, more technical, and more inclusive, better fitted to the conditions that people in the real world actually live in every day. There are countless problems you can have when learning to throw, but only a few things that are common to almost everybody that really make the difference. It's these difference makers that we need to concentrate on. In a sense, you already know how to throw weapons because when it's being done right, it's instinctive. In fact, a lot of people in our school refer to it as the instinctive school of throwing. Every student finds out that when your mind is empty, it goes right. When it's not, when you try to force it, that's when you miss. If you're doing it right, you're having fun, and it is very easy. The main thing a teacher does is to show you how to get out of your own way so your instincts can take over. Of course, you can also do this for yourself. It just usually takes a little longer than when you have a teacher on hand. The main key when you're self-taught is to be honest in your self-observations. You're going to find that the part of your brain that throws weapons and the part that uses language are two different parts. When you're actually out on the target range struggling, you will find it's hard to retrieve what you learned in a more classroom-like environment. The hardest thing is translating words into actions. That's why we use simple phrases which are intended as aids, easy to remember, to repeat to yourself. It's to help you carry things from the classroom to the throwing range. To begin with, our number one priority is our own safety, and what we're trying to avoid in practice is getting hit with a weapon that doesn't stick in and bounces back at us. That's a common occurrence with beginners, but it happens to everyone sometimes, no matter how experienced you are. The good news is that weapons are typically losing force when they bounce back at you, but the bad news is it doesn't take a lot of force to get hurt if you get hit in the wrong place, and there's not much you can do to prevent getting hit if one comes back wrong. It happens too quickly. I've taught hundreds of students but never had anyone get seriously hurt, but it is potentially dangerous, and it only takes one mistake to change your life. So our first difference maker is this: even if I can't talk you into doing anything else, do get in the habit of wearing eye protection when you're throwing. One other thing I should mention safety-wise that might save you a little grief: hold weapons with the points back towards your wrist in your offhand or weak hand. When you reach for the next weapon to throw, it's less likely you will stick yourself, and it also would help if you happen to fall forward. Pointed backwards, they're less likely to stick you if you fall on them. We're going to learn to throw anything, but it's easier when you're first learning to throw if you start out with something with some weight and some quality. So I recommend custom throwing knives or spikes. They don't necessarily have to be the biggest or the best, but having good equipment will make your life easier in training. Balance is somewhat important in knife throwing, but it's irrelevant to street throwing because we have to adapt to be able to throw anything. We do this by choking up or down on a weapon or changing our release. So don't even worry about the balance of the weapon. Just try to find something with some weight, some thickness you can feel that won't break. We train with unbreakable equipment not because we expect to always have it to carry with us, but so we can graduate to throwing real-world throwing objects with a lot less hassle of always having to replace training equipment. Of course, we're never going to get entirely away from knives because they're the most popular and most versatile throwing weapon, but in martial arts throwing, we don't emphasize knives or relying on them. Throwing spikes work just as well for training, but for whatever reason, they're less popular and not as common. Heat-treated, purpose-designed weapons, not cheap junk off the shelf, are expensive, but they are a good investment because unlike any kind of normal knife, they're built to throw, so they won't bend or break. You can pass them on to your grandchildren, just like we hope you'll pass the skill of throwing on someday. And remember that the more of these you have, the less time you'll spend walking back and forth to your target, and the more time you'll spend throwing. In a perfect world, we would have a symmetrical throwing knife, though in a lot of places, a knife that has a blade on both sides is considered a dagger and is illegal. And there are also limits to the length of a blade you can carry in almost all jurisdictions. This is the Sure Knife, the best no-spin throwing knife in the world. Of course, I would think so because I designed it. This is made by a company called Flying Steel. So in an urban environment, we might want a single blade knife, not too big, that looks like a kitchen knife or something non-threatening, but that is heat treated and made for throwing. We can stick just about anything with a point, but typically we aren't going to practice with things like scissors or pocket knives because they aren't made for it, and the pin in them will shear off very easily. Some of them throw quite well, but you'll destroy them if you throw them for very long, so you practice with something else. Also, you don't want to practice using anything with a sharp blade because it's suicidal. You're guaranteed to get cut when something bounces back on you. You need to dull points and blades of practice weapons. You can do this without damaging them by putting tape over the blades. If for some reason you think you must practice with these things, throw at foam or cardboard only and reduce the shock of knives hitting the ground with carpet or by throwing outdoors where there's no concrete or pavement. These targets won't last as long, but they absorb misses better and they're a little safer, and they will help to keep from breaking your kitchen cutlery and pocket knives and other things if you insist on practicing with them.
With safety taken care of, we're almost ready to start throwing. First, let's look at the grips that we will use. In the beginning, there are 2 grips that we need to get comfortable with, and that's our very first exercise.
To hold a weapon for throwing, put your index finger or middle finger, or you can put it between them if you prefer, on the edge of the knife if it has an edge. A spike has no sides, it's totally symmetrical, but with a knife type handle there is an edge and a flat. Put your thumb on the side or the flat and curl your fingers around the bottom. Grip lightly for throwing, but not so lightly it might come out of your hand. Make sure your thumb is on top of the weapon, with the plane of the weapon, if it has one, horizontal. We call this the thumb grip or the street grip. Now let's look at the knife throwing grip, which is really just a variation on the thumb grip. It's very important to note that the plane of your wrist can be either vertical or horizontal, and that the weapon plane, if it has one, can also be either vertical or horizontal. Notice that this change in plane is the main difference in the thumb grip and the finger grip. In the thumb grip, the thumb is on top and the wrist plane is vertical relative to the ground, with the blade plane horizontal. Whereas in the finger grip, the hand is cupped over the top of the weapon and the wrist plane is horizontal or parallel to the ground, with the blade plane vertical. So other than maybe curling your index finger around underneath in the thumb grip, these are actually the same grip, only with your wrist turned at a 90 degrees one way or the other. This means it's effortless to switch from one of these grips to the other. It really is about as simple as turning your wrist over. The rule of thumb, if you'll pardon the pun, is that you will get more control with a thumb on top grip, so it's used for smaller weapons or improvised weapons, but you get more power with a finger on top grip, so it's used with bigger weapons like big throwing knives, so we also call it a knife throwing grip. Now let's choke up and down using both grips to get a feel for finding a comfortable spot for throwing. Locate the balance point, which is simply the spot where the weapon will sit without tipping in either direction. Notice how the balance of a weapon feels different at certain points, especially the balance point.
The reason we learn to choke up and down on a weapon is this. It allows us to adjust the balance point of the weapon to our hand to get the right feel for that particular weapon.
It's usually said that people have 5 senses, but you could just as easily say we have 6 because we tend to forget our sense of balance, which senses gravity. So let's think about one of those things that we already know instinctively due to our sense of balance, but don't really think about it much consciously. If you push on a seesaw at one side or the other of the balance point, it will tip one way or the other. But if you push on it at just the balance point, it won't flip or tip. That's a very important thing to realize about no spin throwing. You'll have to develop this feel for the balance point of a weapon with experience and instinct, but the main thing to know is this: you can help freeze a weapon in point first profile by pushing on the balance point as you throw it, not above or below it. So that's usually why we choke up or down, to get either our fingertip for a knife throwing grip or our thumb tip on a street grip closer to the balance point, because that's what will give us maximum control over the weapon.
Urban survival throwing has the theme of resilience, of adaptation. We want to be able to throw under the biggest set of circumstances possible, and that means being able to throw anything we can get our hands on.
While of course some things throw better than others, there is no magic knife or magic weapon that sticks itself regardless of how it's balanced. We often demonstrate a throw of an ordinary screwdriver to demonstrate this. It's the thrower, not the weapon, that makes the difference. Certain types of throwing with big weapons that involve wrist action, where you can use more of a knife throwing style than a street style, work best if you use weapons that are balanced like a screwdriver or a knife, with the weight more on the handle side. But in improvisational throwing, we're not going to worry about balance points other than to say if the weight of a weapon is too far one way or the other, you adjust your grip upwards or downwards until it feels more comfortable. Eventually, you will learn to also adjust your whole throwing motion and release point according to the weapon. Instinctive throwing is not about precise measurements, it's about your inborn sense of balance. In that way, it's a lot like riding a bicycle. You weren't born doing it, and there was a time you didn't know how, but you were born with a sense of balance. And once that instinctive sense of balance kicks in, you don't ever forget it. It's hard to believe you ever didn't know.
Finally, we're ready to throw, but let's not even worry about a real target quite yet. Let's just throw at the ground, or if you have a block of wood or a board or a thick piece of cardboard or foam you want to lie on the ground to throw at, that's fine too, but the ground is all we really need.
We talked a little about gravity, and what we want to learn to do now is to use gravity to our advantage. What we want to remember or even repeat to ourselves when we get to the range is this: don't force it, use the force of gravity.
Now that we're armed with both our weapon and our first catchphrase, we can finally get to another exercise.
All we're trying to do to start with is stick a knife in the ground using gravity to help us. This is our next exercise. Just drop a spike or a knife or a pointed weapon of any kind into the ground so that it sticks, or if you prefer, into a log in on the ground. Don't just let it go and let it drop, or it usually won't have quite enough energy to stick in. What we want to do is just swing our arm a little to get some momentum and time the release of the weapon so that it will stick. You might use a little bit of a chop with your elbow if you like, or if you don't, keep your elbow more straight and just move your arm using your shoulder. Whatever works for you. Don't force it, let it fall. Gravity will pull it into the ground. Timing the release is everything. Just let it fall right out of your hand at the right moment, which you will know by instinct, not by thinking about it, and in it goes. Everything we do centers around this very simple technique of using the force created by gravity and just a little momentum from our arm swing to pull the point of a weapon into a target. Do this using both of the grips we learned, first with the thumb on top, which is a little easier for most people because the thumb is by far most coordinated digit. Don't snap your thumb or your wrist very much at first. Just use elbow action or a little arm motion to get some momentum, then just let it drop. Now with the index finger on top. This is slightly more difficult, but again, don't force it, use the force. Just time the drop correctly and let the weapon fall right out of your hand in a smooth motion. If you can do this in the ground, believe it or not, you can just as easily do it into a vertical target.
Repeat sticking a weapon into the ground until you find it so easy you're bored with it, which shouldn't take too long. Then we'll move to a vertical target and do the same thing. But first, let's look at vertical targets, since now we're going to need one.
We use mostly big flat boards like this, preferably made of pine or something soft. This is the best type of urban target, and this is what just about everybody ends up using. It's made of scrap lumber or something you can get at a big box home improvement store. Cheap 2x4s or better, 2x6s or 2x8s. The wider the board, the better, because then the targets will have fewer cracks between them, which makes for less nails and a smoother surface. These targets are highly mobile and relatively safe because the flat angle makes them a little more predictable on misses, and you can make them fairly large as well so they act as their own backstop. Of course, you don't want anything elaborate or expensive because you're going to destroy it anyway. There's nothing sillier than a fancy knife throwing target. Targets don't stay the same for long. You'll always be taking boards in and out. You can add to the life of a board target just by turning it upside down. You usually see people throwing at targets that are about as tall as a person, but the fact is you can use lower targets, waist high or even lower if you like. The physical mechanics of a low target are the same as throwing at higher targets, so it won't ruin you for throwing higher if you want to use these. Just as importantly, low targets are also the safest to practice on because you don't get weapons coming back at your face as easily. They're usually easier to set up.
So now it's time for another exercise. This time we want to drop a weapon into a standing target just like we did with the ground. What's happening is that the weapon is released about here, 12 o'clock, and then gravity just brings the point down right into the target at 3 o'clock.
Believe it or not, throwing at the vertical target is the same as throwing at the ground because gravity is still in effect and still pulling the point down into the target. Gravity will still suck the point of the weapon into the target if you release it at the right moment, which if you are throwing overhand is when it's still pointing at the sky. All no-spin throws have the same basic pattern of a half circle. The weapon begins in your hand pointed back at about 9 o'clock, then it's released at about 12 o'clock. Then a combination of the momentum of your arm and gravity carries it that last quarter circle, and it sticks into the target at about 3 o'clock. The faster your arm moves or the longer the arc formed by your arm motion, the further the weapon flies. That's another little phrase you can take to the range with you, the halfway around the clock rule or the 12, 9, and 3 rule. Remember to release at 12 to stick at 3, 9 to get some momentum. Just drop it in, don't try to throw hard. All you have to do is let go at the right moment and it can't do anything but drop in, just like the ground drop. Practice this with both grips as you like.
Some people fail to move from the ground target to the vertical target because of very basic mistakes they make in their foot position, shoulder position, or elbow position that prevent them from being able to drop the weapon into the target comfortably.
First, foot position. It usually helps if you have the foot opposite your throwing arm a little closer to the target than the other foot. If you're a right-handed thrower, lead with your left foot. Next, shoulder position. The shoulder opposite your throwing arm should be closer to the target than your throwing shoulder. In other words, your left shoulder, if you are right-handed, points towards the target. You aren't standing facing the target with your shoulders parallel to it. Third, watch your elbow and the angle of your forearm. For most people in doing this exercise, we need to begin with our elbow at about shoulder height. Your forearm should be like the weapon, pointing at the sky directly above your elbow. In other words, your forearm should be at a 90-degree angle to your upper arm. You generate a little momentum for the throw by swinging your elbow and flip your thumb or your wrist just a little to give the weapon a little energy on release if you like. But don't overcomplicate it. All we're trying to do is replicate what you were doing when you let a weapon drop into the ground. If you are throwing knife throwing style with the fingers on top for control instead of the thumb, you'll want to bend your wrist back a little more to generate a little momentum with the knife. You will also probably have your elbow a little higher than with a thumb grip throw.
When you master the drop of a weapon into a vertical target, what you need to do is to get some repetitions more resembling actual throwing, gradually trying to increase your range and your power a little. Repetition is the mother of all learning.
What you're going to find as you do so is that you will get sticks for a while, of course missing sometimes, and then eventually you will get adventurous or take a break, and at some point you'll lose the plot, so to speak, and not be able to stick much of anything. What is almost certainly happening when you start missing is that you are releasing too late or snapping your wrist or thumb too hard. I tell students to release earlier, release with a point towards the sky, and they understand the words and they want to do it, but when it comes time to throw, they just can't do it at first because they don't have faith. Their hand thinks it has to force the weapon to drop in, and that's the one thing you can do to screw it up. The weapon wants to drop in just like it did into the ground, but the beginner won't let it because they try to force it, and that's just what causes the weapon to start overspinning, hitting the target with a point down or worse, spinning all the way around.
That leads us to our next exercise. Try your best to get a weapon to hit with the point up by releasing too early. This is much better than releasing too late.
Push on the weapon's balance point if necessary. You might also use a locked wrist action or less finger action, but the main thing is to release early enough to cause the weapon to strike in a point-up profile. This will help you to see what you're doing wrong and help you to gain confidence that you can take steps to correct it. It's easy to correct when weapons hit point up. You just add a little more wrist or thumb action or a later release. It's much harder to fix the opposite.
You aren't going to stick targets if you hit with the points up, obviously, but that wasn't the point of the exercise. Beginners think they're failing if weapons aren't sticking in, but that's not necessarily true.
Don't worry about whether throws stick in or not so much as you worry about point first impact. Weapons might not be sticking in because they're hitting at an angle to a flat target or against the wood grain, or the points are dull, or the type of wood is either too hard or so soft that the weapons tear out chunks and don't stay in firmly. Stick percentage is meaningless as a gauge of success. I always say you can make 100 perfect throws at a brick wall and none of them will stick. Watch what's happening, whether weapons are hitting with the point up or the point down. If they're hitting with the point but bouncing off, that's less of a worry. The quick fix if weapons are hitting at an angle to a flat board is to simply turn yourself at an angle so the blade is hitting at 90 degrees instead of 45 degrees. But I don't necessarily recommend it, since actually bouncing knives off at a 45-degree angle is a lot safer than having them bounce back at you.
So let's do everything in order as one whole that combines the parts and ingrain good fundamentals into our form.
1, let's get the foot that is opposite our throwing hand a little closer to the target and turn our shoulders more square to the target, not parallel to the target. 2, weapon up, pointing at the sky, then backwards a little for momentum if necessary. Elbow at shoulder level. 3, throw with an easy but definite motion, not tentative and not too choppy. Just one smooth, confident motion with our arm. Time the release right, and the weapon has to hit with the point.
It's important to remember something else on the throwing range, and that's when to get off the range.
If you struggle, go back to throwing into the ground or the very short range drop-in throw to get your mind right. Get back to the basics of grip, balance point, early release, using the force of gravity to let it drop in. Don't try to just will yourself into hitting when you're missing over and over. It's only negative reinforcement. You're putting bad habits into your muscle memory that will have to be unlearned later. It's better to not throw at all than to repeatedly throw wrong. You'll find that you hit in streaks and miss in streaks. Psychological momentum is the difference maker. You miss because your mechanics break down, and your mechanics break down because of your psychological state. This is magnified in the early training of weapons throwers. My students typically tell me that there's a night and day difference. They know when it's going in and when it isn't as soon as they let it go. You have to learn how to build yourself back up after you lose it, because early on it comes and goes. I don't recommend this because it's too dangerous, but I've actually seen people throw better with their eyes closed because it lets them relax and center themselves and visualize what they should be doing. Sometimes it helps to watch video of successful throws, and if you can video yourself to make critiques of yourself, that can also be helpful.
If you're dropping weapons into the board consistently, even if it's only from a few feet away, congratulations, you're already a thrower. Everything we do from now on is only a variation of what you're already doing. Now we just have to get better at it.